Hello, and welcome to Revelations and Grace. This is our final video in the series on the end times. We're going to look at a review of our last episodes, and then we're going to jump into some possible historical fulfillments for the end of the millennium. In the very first video in this series, we covered the question, was Jesus promised to return in his disciples' lifetimes? And we showed that he was. He wasn't making a guess, he wasn't telling a false prophecy, he wasn't lying, he wasn't misunderstood, and the angel in Revelation made an oath that his appearing wouldn't be delayed. So then the only logical conclusion was that Jesus promised to return in his disciples' lifetimes. In another video, we also defended the belief that the Great White Throne Judgement was expected in the disciples' generation. We showed that Jesus' promise to return soon and reward each according to his works in Matthew 16 was the same judgment as the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. And then we showed that the sheep and goats judgment of Matthew 25 was the same judgment as the Great White Throne Judgement in Revelation 20. Not only that, but Jesus promised his disciples would experience the most distressing time in the history of the world when the army surrounded Jerusalem in their generation. And he said never again would there be such a distressing time. He also said this was in fulfillment of Daniel and all that has been written. If we look back in Daniel 12, it describes the most distressing time of the world, and it says at this time, the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked would happen. And if this is the case, then Jesus was promising that the resurrection of the wicked was about to happen. Not only that, but Paul and Peter say explicitly and implicitly that the resurrection of the wicked dead was about to occur. Now, since Revelation 20 at the Great White Throne Judgement is the only place in Revelation that contains the resurrection of the wicked dead, the only place that describes it happening, this is what was meant when they said that the resurrection of the wicked dead was going to happen soon. Revelation 20, the Great White Throne Judgement, was about to be fulfilled. In our video on the resurrection, we challenged several ideas about the resurrection of the dead. We showed that the dead saints were not meant to be resurrected to live on earth forever, but were meant to live in heaven. We showed that they weren't in heaven already waiting for the resurrection, but they were waiting in Sheol or Hades, and that heaven was not opened until the present age had passed. Not only that, but in the resurrection, they would receive new spiritual, heavenly bodies like the angels. And we know that the bodies of the angels can be tangible or intangible, visible or invisible. And in the same way, Jesus' body was a new spiritual heavenly body, and it could walk through walls and appear and disappear at will. So in the resurrection, in Philippians, it says we will have bodies like Jesus. So then the resurrection could have been a tangible or intangible, visible or invisible event. And we looked at a couple historical ideas of how this resurrection could have happened. In our previous video, we questioned if the disciples believed they were living in the millennium, and we showed that they believed the millennium began when Christ ascended into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. We showed that Satan was already bound during Jesus' ministry, and we showed that the resurrection of the martyrs at the beginning of Revelation 20 happened in Matthew 27. Also, the disciples expected the end of the millennium soon. Paul says that Satan was about to be crushed, and they believed that the resurrection of the wicked dead was about to occur. Not only that, but they believed that Jesus was about to return, which would mark the defeat of death. And we looked at how Christians of the first century might have understood the 1,000 years to actually be less than 1,000 years, even 40 years. And now we can continue on to today's video. We're going to look at one possible historical fulfillment for these promises. Now, this is highly speculative territory, and I don't claim that everything I say is perfect. So hopefully it provides a starting point for your research, but you can validate whether this information is true or not and go beyond what I've studied here. I just hope that it provides at least some evidence that Jesus fulfilled the promises he said he would. Let's start with defining who Gog and Magog is. In Revelation, I believe or speculate that Gog was the unbelieving Jews and Magog was either Rome or the land of Rome. Unbelieving Jews are called Babylon, Sodom, and Egypt in Revelation. And since the new covenant came into effect, God's people were reconstituted. It was no longer ethnic Jews who were God's people, but those who shared in the faith of Jesus who became God's people. Not only that, but old unbelieving Israel had become their enemy in the faith by killing Christ and persecuting the saints. In Revelation 20, it says that Gog came against the camp of God's people. In Revelation, God's people is never defined as old unbelieving Israel. That's a term reserved for Christians. You can see that in Revelation 14:12. I argue that when Satan was released, likely in 63 AD, he used unbelieving Jews to convince Rome to use the sword of Caesar against Christians in an empire-wide persecution. A Facebook friend of mine, Tom Mills, believes that this echoes the story of Esther. Tom Mills from Preterist and Futurist Debate and Discussion Group on Facebook says, "Did you know in the Septuagint, in the story of Esther, Haman, the villain of the story that tried to kill all the Jews by the king's decree, is called a Gogite? The Hebrew scriptures say Agagite, but in the Septuagint it's Gogite. I find that very enlightening. In the same way that Babylon from the Old Testament is used to describe Israel in the New Testament, I think that perhaps it is the same thing with the Gogites applying to some villain in the New too." That's Tom Mills from the Facebook group. In Revelation, perhaps Gog is the unbelieving Jews who wish to persecute God's people using Nero's decree, just like King Xerxes' decree, to carry it out. They were acting like Haman the Gogite. As another line of evidence, we can look at how Gog is destroyed in Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 verses 21 through 22. "I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him, and on his troops, and on the many nations with him." In the siege of Jerusalem, Jewish rebel factions warred against each other, and they suffered plagues and bloodshed and famine and Roman hailstones that was prophesied in Deuteronomy 28 for breaking a covenant. Ultimately, they were destroyed by fire, as Revelation 20 verse 9 prophesies. It seems the unbelieving Jews died in the siege in the same way that Ezekiel prophesies that Gog would be destroyed. So if Gog was unbelieving Jews and Magog was Rome, let's look at the next question. How was Satan released? Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10. "When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves." Notice when Satan is released, he goes and deceives Gog and Magog into persecuting God's people, which we've covered are the Christians. In 64 AD, when a fire broke out in Rome, which was likely caused by Nero, he falsely blamed the Christians for the fire and started an empire-wide persecution against Christians. Christians were hunted down and subjected to torture, and for the first time in history, the sword of Caesar was used against the Christian belief. Tertullian Apology, Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 3, Verse 22. "Search your records, then you shall find that Nero was the first that used Caesar's sword against this sect, which at that time greatly increased in Rome. However, we glory in the author of our condemnation, for he who understands knows that Nero could only condemn that which is very good." Philip Schaff tells us that Sulpicius Severus, in his chronicle, gives a pretty full account of the horrors suffered in Rome, but mostly copied from Tacitus. Both he and Orosius were the first to clearly assert that Nero extended the persecution to the provinces. Both of these were Christian writers, and Orosius worked with both Augustine and Jerome. That's Ed Stevens' The Final Decade, page 152. Ed Stevens, in his book The Final Decade, on page 155, says, "But Orazio Marucci, the Roman Catholic scholar, mentions several Roman and Italian sources, who indicate that the Neronic persecution was not just confined to Rome or Italy, but rather, quote-unquote, extended through the length and breadth of the empire. The burning of Rome was but a pretext, for the Christians were to be considered as enemies of the human race. End quote. That's Orazio Marucci, Manual of Christian Archaeology, page 29. Schaff, History of the Christian Church. Under this wanton charge of incendiarism, backed by the equally groundless charge of misanthropy and unnatural vice, there began a carnival of blood such as even heathen Rome never saw before or since. It was the answer of the powers of hell to the mighty preaching of the two chief apostles, which had shaken heathenism to its foundations. A quote-unquote vast multitude, end quote, of Christians were put to death in the most shocking manner. Some were crucified, probably in mockery of the punishment of Christ. Some sewed up in skins of wild beasts and exposed to the ferocity of mad dogs in the arena. The satanic tragedy reached its climax at night in the imperial gardens on the slope of the Vatican, which embraced, it is supposed, the present site of the place and church of St. Peter. Christian men and women, covered with pitch or oil or resin, and nailed to posts of pine, were lighted and burned as torches for the amusement of the mob, while Nero, in fantastical dress, figured in a horse race, and displayed his art as a charioteer. Burning alive was the ordinary punishment of incendiaries, but only the cruel ingenuity of this imperial monster, under the inspiration of the devil, could invent such a horrible system of illumination. That's Schaff, History of the Christian Church. So obviously that was a really distressing time, and I can see no better time to mark the release of Satan than in the Neronic persecution. Satan deceived Rome into persecuting the Christians using the fire. And that brings us to our next question. How did Jesus return on the clouds? Well, a few historians recorded an event in 66 AD that would seem to describe the return of Christ on the clouds. Antiquities of the Jews, books 17 through 20, The Life of Flavius Josephus, writing in AD 75. Besides these signs, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month Artemisius, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds, and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking, and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude, saying, "Let us remove hence." That's Antiquities of the Jews, books 17 through 20, The Life of Flavius Josephus. Josephus is one of the most well-known Jewish historians of that time. His works are quoted in Christian churches, and much of his works have been relied upon and validated by Christians, historians, and preachers. He was a Jewish priest and general during the siege of 70 AD and was defeated and surrendered to the Romans. He later became a historian and recorded the events witnessed during the war. Eusebius, an early church father, also quotes this section from Josephus, writing around AD 325 in his volume Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 8. Tacitus, likely writing around AD 115, in Histories, Book 5, Verse 13, states, "Prodigies had occurred, but their expiation by the offering of victims or solemn vows is held to be unlawful by a nation which is the slave of superstition and the enemy of true beliefs. In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. A sudden lightning flash from the clouds lit up the temple. The doors of the holy place abruptly opened. A superhuman voice was heard to declare that the gods were leaving it, and in the same instant came the rushing tumult of their departure. Few people placed a sinister interpretation on this. The majority were convinced that the ancient scriptures of their priests alluded to the present as the very time when the Orient would triumph and from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world." Again, that's Histories, Book 5, verse 13. Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian, and was known to be one of the greatest Roman historians of his time. He was known to be very factual and careful in his works, and he despised Christianity. One of his duties was to supervise foreign religious cults in Rome. His works are used to validate the crucifixion of Christ to Christians. Pseudo-Hegesippus, chapter 44. Translated from the Latin by Wade Blocker, this excerpt is taken from the Latin edited by Vincent Asani, cited in fulfilledtheology.ning.com. After many days, a certain figure appeared of tremendous size, which many saw, just as the books of the Jews have disclosed. And before the setting of the sun, there were suddenly seen in the clouds chariots and armed battle arrays, by which the cities of all Judea and its territories were invaded. Sepher Yosippon, A Medieval History of Ancient Israel, translated from the Hebrew by Stephen B. Bowman, chapter 87, Burning of the Temple. Moreover, in those days were seen chariots of fire and horsemen, a great force flying across the sky, near to the ground, coming against Jerusalem and all the land of Judah, all of them horses of fire and riders of fire. Notice the different wording for each of these historical accounts. It shows that they didn't all come from the same source, but that their sources were independent of each other, which gives further credibility that this event actually happened historically. Well, what about Matthew 24:30, where it says, "All the people of the earth shall see him"? And I'd argue this is an improper translation. It should actually be translated, "all the tribes of the land." That's how the International Standard Version translates it. And this would be referring to the land of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. So if Satan was released around 63 AD, what about the part in Revelation 20 that says he was thrown into the lake of fire, and Gog and Magog were destroyed by fire? How did this happen historically? Revelation 20 verses 9 and 10. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. If Jerusalem is Gog, then when the Romans sieged the city of Jerusalem and destroyed it by fire, this would fulfill the prophecy that Gog was destroyed by fire from heaven. But what about Magog and Satan? How were they destroyed by fire? Well, we have an event of fire coming down from heaven and destroying Magog a few short years later in 79 AD with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The fire was so great that the Romans believed it was sent by God. Cassius Dio, Epitome of Book, 66, sections 22 through 24. Such is Vesuvius, and these phenomena usually occur there every year. But all the other occurrences that had taken place there in the course of time, however notable, because unusual, they may have seemed to those who on each occasion observed them, nevertheless would be regarded as trivial in comparison with what now happened, even if all had been combined into one. This is what befell. Numbers of huge men, quite surpassing any human stature, such creatures in fact as the giants are pictured to have been, appeared, now on the mountain, now in the surrounding country, and again in the cities, wandering over the earth day and night, and also flitting through the air. After this, fearful droughts and sudden and violent earthquakes occurred, so that the whole plain round about seethed, and the summits leaped into the air. There were frequent rumblings, some of them subterranean, that resembled thunder, and some on the surface that sounded like bellowings. The sea also joined in the roar, and the sky re-echoed it. Then suddenly a portentous crash was heard, as if the mountains were tumbling in ruins, and first huge stones were hurled aloft, rising as high as the very summits. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke, so that the whole atmosphere was obscured, and the sun was entirely hidden, as if eclipsed. Thus day was turned into night, and light into darkness. Some thought that the giants were rising again in revolt, for at this time also many of their forms could be discerned in the smoke, and moreover a sound of trumpets was heard. While others believed that the whole universe was being resolved into chaos or fire. Therefore they fled, some from the houses into the streets, others from outside into the houses, now from the sea to the land, and now from the land to the sea, for in their excitement they regarded any place where they were not as safer than where they were. While this was going on, an inconceivable quantity of ashes was blown out, which covered both sea and land, and filled the air. It wrought much injury of various kinds, as chance befell, to men, farms, and cattle, and in particular it destroyed all fish and birds. Furthermore, it buried 2 entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii, the latter place while its populace was seated in the theater. Indeed, the amount of dust, if taken all together, was so great that some of it reached Africa, and Syria, and Egypt, and it also reached Rome, filling the air overhead and darkening the sun. There too no little fear was occasioned, that lasted for several days, since the people did not know and could not imagine what had happened, but like those close at hand, believed that the whole world was being turned upside down, that the sun was disappearing into the earth, and that the earth was being lifted into the sky. These ashes now did the Romans no great harm at the time, though later they brought terrible pestilence upon them. However, a second conflagration, which is a fire, above ground in the following year, spread over very large sections of Rome, while Titus was absent in Campania, attending to the catastrophe that had befallen that region. It consumed the temple of Serapis, the temple of Isis, the Septa, the temple of Neptune, the baths of Agrippa, the Pantheon, the Diribitorium, the theater of Balbus, the stage building of Pompey's theater, the Octavian buildings together with their books, and the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, with their surrounding temples. Hence the disaster seemed to be not of human, but of divine origin, for anyone can estimate from the list of buildings that I have given how many others must have been destroyed. This event seems to closely match the prophecy in Revelation 20 verses 9 through 10, that fire came down from heaven and devoured them. This occurs a few short years after Satan's release, fulfilling the verse that he must be released for a little while. Cassius Dio writes, hence the disaster seemed to not be of human, but of divine origin. These people would likely have described heaven and earth shaking in quite a literal way. I speculate that the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum on the coastlands of Rome was likely in fulfillment of the prophecy in Ezekiel 39. Ezekiel 39, verse 6. I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they will know that I am the Lord. Well, what about Satan's destruction by fire? How was he thrown into the lake of fire? Well, the fire that spread through Rome destroyed most of the pagan temples. And even more so, the people who used to worship false gods believed that the gods were destroyed at this time. Pliny the Younger, letter 6, verse 20. There were some so afraid of death that they prayed for death. Many raised their hands to the gods, and even more believed that there were no gods any longer, and that this was the one last unending night for the world. I believed that I was perishing with the world, and the world with me, which was a great consolation for death. So even those who worship Satan and the demons believed that they were destroyed at this time. Not only that, but some members of the early church living after 79 AD believed that Satan was destroyed at this time. You can see quotes in the article listed below from Athanasius, Melito of Sardis, and the Odes of Solomon that show that Satan had been destroyed. The Jews or Greeks believed that this destruction was the wrath of God. John J. Collins, Sibylline Oracles, a new translation and introduction. And showers will fall from heaven like red earth. Know then the wrath of the heavenly God. To see more evidence, check out The Destruction of Pompeii, God's Revenge by Herschel Shanks. And now we can address the final question. How was death defeated? Well, notice that when Jesus defeated death, he wasn't defeating physical death, he was defeating Hades' death, that afterlife death of going to Sheol or Hades when you died, instead of going to heaven or the lake of fire. Revelation 20, verses 13 through 14. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 54 through 57. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, And this mortal has put on immortality. Then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. As we covered in the video about the resurrection, the saints were generally not allowed into heaven before 70 AD, with exception to those saints who were resurrected in Matthew 27. When Jesus came, he defeated death and opened heaven to the saints. Revelation 14, verse 13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Write this down. Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they are blessed indeed, for they will rest from their hard work, for their good deeds follow them. Hebrews more clearly tells us that heaven wasn't opened yet. Hebrews 9, verse 8. By this the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened, as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. Hebrews 11, verses 16 and verse 40. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And in verse 40, God having planned something better for us, so that not apart from us they should be made perfect. Hebrews 13, verse 14. For here we do not have an abiding city, but we are seeking the coming one. Notice the first section of the earthly temple is symbolic for the present age. And the author of Hebrews is saying that so long as they are in the present age, the way into the holy places is not yet disclosed. It's not yet opened. But in Hebrews, the holy places is a synonym for heaven. Hebrews 8, verses 1 and 2. Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, and the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Hebrews 9, verse 24. For Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Do you see how Hebrews uses the holy places and heaven interchangeably? He's saying that the way into the holy places, or heaven, was not opened so long as they were in the present age. And when Christ came, it would end the present age, it would be in the age to come, and it would change the afterlife experience. Instead of going to Hades when they died, they would go to heaven or the lake of fire. So when the Bible says that Christ would defeat death, and it says that Hades was thrown into the lake of fire, it's talking about that afterlife death that's defeated. Even some members of the earliest church, living after 70 AD, believed that death was defeated at this time, and that from this time forward, they would all go to heaven when they died, no longer Hades or Sheol. And we can also testify that this is our reality today when we hear of accounts of people who've had near-death experiences. So, in conclusion, this represents one possible theory on how these events could have been fulfilled. Gog and Magog likely represented unbelieving Jews and Rome teaming up to persecute the Christians. When Satan was released around 63 AD, he likely used this connection to blame the fire on the Christians and start an empire-wide persecution and torture of Christians. Not only this, but God destroyed Gog and Magog by sending down fire on Jerusalem from the Roman siege, and also on the Rome using Vesuvius. Vesuvius also destroyed the pagan temples, and those who worshipped Satan and the demons at this time believed that their gods were no more. Also, the earliest church fathers believed that Satan was destroyed at this time. The beliefs of the early church living today show that death was defeated, that is, death, Hades' death, and that they would go to heaven today when they died. Also, we can look at accounts of near-death experiences to see that people go to heaven today when they die, not Hades. Well, thank you for listening. This is a lot of content, and I appreciate your patience getting through it. This presents one possible theory on how this stuff could have happened, and it's perfectly legitimate for you to question it and to do more research than I've done. But hopefully it strengthens your faith that Jesus came and did what he said he would do. Thanks for listening. This is the end of our series on the end times.